Please take me." "I'll do anything," the woman gasped, collapsing against the weathered doorframe as dawn broke over the McGraw ranch. Zeke McGrath stood in his doorway, rifle loose in his grip, studying the stranger who had materialized from the morning shadows. Blood stained her torn dress, burned scars marked her hands like old prayers. Her dark skin caught the first light, and her eyes held the particular desperation of someone who had run out of choices. She clutched a leather satchel against her chest and a crumpled paper in her other hand. The wanted poster bore her likeness, though the artist had made her look harder than she appeared now, broken against his threshold. "Will you marry me?" Zeke asked. The words surprised them both. Magnolia Carter blinked up at him, certain she had misheard. The rancher's face remained steady, carved by years of prairie wind and disappointment. He lowered the rifle completely. "I said, will you marry me?" Magnolia struggled to her feet, never releasing her grip on the satchel. The morning air carried the scent of dust and dying grass. Somewhere in the distance, cattle loaded against the coming heat. "You don't know me. I know enough." Zeke stepped aside, gesturing her into the house. "You're running from something that scares you more than a stranger's proposal, and I'm about to lose everything I've worked for unless I can prove to the bank that I'm a stable family man." She hesitated at the threshold. Trust had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Yet here was a man offering shelter instead of chains. "What did you do?" Zeke asked, nodding toward the wanted poster. "Stole something that wasn't mine to take." Magnolia's voice carried the weight of justified sin. "At least that's what they're calling it." Zeke poured water from a pitcher into a basin, set it on the kitchen table. The simple gesture spoke of hospitality that expected nothing in return. Magnolia approached cautiously, set down her satchel, but kept it within reach. The kitchen was sparse but clean. No woman's touch softened the practical arrangement of tools and supplies. This was a man's space, functional and lonely. "The bank comes tomorrow," Zeke said. "Cornelius Blackwood has been buying up every ranch in the territory. Mine's the last one standing in his way." Magnolia cleaned her hands in the basin. The water turned pink with blood from scratches she hadn't noticed. Her body was cataloging injuries, while her mind calculated possibilities. "What makes you think marriage will change anything?" "Blackwood's been telling everyone I'm too unstable to manage property. A lone man can't build anything lasting, he says, but a married man with prospects." Zeke shrugged. "That's different. And what do I get besides a name, protection, a roof? Time to figure out what comes next." The honesty was more unsettling than deception would have been. Magnolia had grown accustomed to lies, to people wanting things from her that she wasn't willing to give. This man's straightforward desperation felt almost foreign. Hoofbeats approached from the distance. Zeke moved to the window, his body tensing with recognition. A star gleamed on the rider's chest as he drew closer. "Sheriff Rawlings," Zeke said, "you need to decide now." Magnolia looked at the wanted poster, then at the approaching lawman, then at the rancher who had offered her an impossible salvation. The satchel in her arms contained secrets that could destroy powerful men. But those same secrets could get her killed if discovered. If I say yes, there's no taking it back. There's no taking back what's already been done. Zeke's eyes met hers. "The question is whether we face what's coming alone or together." Sheriff Rawlings dismounted outside, his spurs ringing against the porch steps. Magnolia made her choice the way she had learned to make all choices in recent months. Quickly, without looking back, yes. Zeke nodded once, then opened the door before the sheriff could knock. "Morning, Sheriff." Zeke. Rawlings stepped inside without invitation, his gaze immediately finding Magnolia. "Heard you might have company." "My wife." The lie came easily to Zeke's lips. "Magnolia McGraw." Rawlings studied her face, then pulled out a folded paper. The wanted poster matched the one Magnolia had been carrying, but this version was official, bearing territorial seals. Magnolia Carter wanted for theft and destruction of property. Rawlings looked between them. Funny thing about harboring fugitive, Zeke. It can get a man hanged for treason. The word treason hit the room like a physical blow. Magnolia's fingers tightened on her satchel. Whatever they thought she had stolen, it was more significant than simple property. My wife's maiden name was Carter, Zeke said calmly. We were married by Justice Hale yesterday evening. That's so. Rawlings folded the poster. Well then, congratulations to you both. The sheriff's tone suggested he believed neither the marriage nor its timing, but something held him back from making an arrest. He touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. I'll be around checking on things, making sure everyone's settling in proper. After Rawlings left, silence filled the kitchen like smoke. Magnolia and Zeke faced each other across the room. Two strangers who had just committed to a lie that could save or damn them both. Justice Hale, Magnolia said finally, he'll marry us proper today. Make it legal. Zeke began clearing the breakfast dishes he hadn't eaten. If you're still willing. Magnolia looked out the window at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward mountains she couldn't name. Somewhere behind those peaks lay the life she had fled. Somewhere ahead lay consequences she couldn't predict. But here, in this moment, stood a man who had offered partnership instead of ownership. I'm willing. Justice of the peace Tobias Hale's hands trembled as he opened his leather-bound book. His parlor smelled of old paper and nervous sweat. The afternoon light slanted through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the floor where Zeke and Magnolia stood apart from each other. Dearly beloved, Hale began, then stopped. He wiped his brow with a handkerchief already damp from use. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Ezekiel McGraw and Magnolia Carter in holy matrimony. The words felt hollow in the small room. Magnolia kept her satchel pressed against her side. Zeke's Sunday shirt was wrinkled from hasty preparation. Neither looked at the other during the recitation. Hale's voice grew steadier as he continued, but his eyes darted frequently to the window. When he reached the vows, his careful pronunciation suggested he was choosing each word with deliberate precision. Do you, Ezekiel, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, so long as you both shall live? I do. And do you, Magnolia, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, so long as you both shall live? Magnolia's voice came quietly. I do. Hale closed the book with relief. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. No kiss sealed the union. Zeke nodded to Hale, paid him with coins from his pocket, and led Magnolia outside to his wagon. Ceremony had taken less than 10 minutes. The ride back to the ranch passed in silence, broken only by creaking wheels and wind through dried grass. Magnolia studied the landscape with careful attention, memorizing landmarks and escape routes from habit. Tell me about the plantation. Zeke said. Finally, Magnolia's jaw tightened. The memories lived in her scars, in the way she startled at sudden sounds, in her instinct to calculate distance to the nearest door. Cornelius Blackwood owned it, still does far as the law is concerned. Her voice carried the weight of institutional betrayal. After emancipation, he found new ways to keep his workers, debt contracts, false charges, men with guns to make sure nobody left without permission. Zeke's hands tightened on the res. You left without permission. I left with proof. The satchel rested between them on the wagon seat, innocuous as a sleeping snake. Zeke glanced at it, but didn't ask what proof she meant. Some secrets required time and trust before they could be spoken. Blackwood's empire stretches from Louisiana to Colorado territory. Now, Magnolia continued, he buys land through fraud, then uses that land as collateral to buy more. Your ranch sits right in the middle of his planned railroad route. How do you know about my ranch? I know about all his targets. Magnolia adjusted her position as the wagon hit a rut. I kept his books for 3 years before I understood what the numbers meant. The admission hung between them. Zeke processed the revelation that his new wife possessed intimate knowledge of his enemy's operations. The marriage of necessity was revealing unexpected advantages. Can you still keep books? Better than most. They reached the ranch as the sun settled toward the western mountains. Magnolia surveyed the property with professional assessment. The house needed repairs but showed good bones. The barn was solid. The grazing land stretched toward hills that would provide natural windbreaks. How many head of cattle? She asked. 137, as of last count. Zeke unhitched the horses with practiced efficiency. Blackwood's men have been driving them off gradually, cutting fences, poisoning water sources. Magnolia nodded. The tactics were familiar from other acquisitions she had documented in ledger books that no longer existed. They'll escalate now that you're married. Why? Because marriage means you're not giving up. She lifted her satchel from the wagon. It means you're planning to stay and fight. Over the following days, Magnolia proved her worth beyond the legal protection their union provided. She identified which cattle had been deliberately scattered and organized their recovery. Her knowledge of land law helped Zeke understand exactly which property rights Blackwood was trying to challenge. The townspeople of Coyote Creek watched the interracial couple with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Some crossed the street to avoid acknowledging them. Others offered subtle nods of support when they thought no one was looking. Mrs. Henderson at the general store spoke in clipped sentences when Magnolia came to buy supplies, but she also slipped extra flour into the order without charging for it. Mr. Kowalski at the feed store glared openly, but still filled their grain request without adulteration. The division in the community was becoming clear. Blackwood supporters made their disapproval known through cold shoulders and whispered conversations that stopped when the McGraw approached. But others, those who had lost land or family to Blackwood's expansion, offered quiet assistance. Tom Brennan, who ran a small spread north of town, stopped by one evening ostensibly to borrow tools. Instead, he spent an hour discussing water rights and grazing boundaries with Magnolia. Her understanding of territorial law impressed him enough that he began asking her advice on protecting his own property. That woman knows her business, he told his wife later. Zeke McGraw married himself a partner, not just a wife, but the partnership was developing beyond business necessity. When Magnolia found Zeke struggling to repair a broken fence post in fading light, she held the wood steady without being asked. When she worked late over account books, he brought her coffee without speaking. Small gestures accumulated into something neither had expected. Respect was growing into trust. Trust was growing into something deeper that neither dared name. One evening, as they worked together mending harnesses by lamplight, Magnolia spoke into the comfortable silence. The plantation house burned the night I left. Her needle moved steadily through leather. They'll say I set the fire. I didn't. Zeke's hand stilled on the bridle he was cleaning. He waited for her to continue, but I didn't try to stop it either. The confession settled between them like shared guilt. Zeke resumed his work on the leather, his movements careful and deliberate. Sometimes letting something burn is the only way to clear ground for new growth. Magnolia looked up from her sewing. In the lamplight, Zeke's weathered face showed understanding rather than judgment. The weight she had carried alone for months felt suddenly shared. Outside, wind rattled the windows and set the barn door creaking on its hinges. Storm clouds were building over the mountains, promising rain that the drought-stricken land desperately needed. "They're coming," Magnolia said quietly. "Blackwood's men. I saw them watching from the ridge today." Zeke nodded. He had seen them, too. "How long do we have?" "Not long." She set down her needle and thread. "There's something else you need to know about what's in that satchel." Before she could continue, hoofbeats approached through the darkness, multiple riders moving with purpose rather than haste. Zeke blew out the lamp and moved to the window. 6 men sat their horses in the yard, their faces shadowed by hat brims. The leader spurred his mount closer to the house. "Zeke McGraw," he called, "come on out. We've got business to discuss." Magnolia's hand found Zeke's in the darkness. Her grip was steady despite the danger gathering outside their door. "Together," she whispered. "Together," he agreed. They stepped out onto the porch to face whatever Blackwood's men had brought them. The riders melted back into darkness after delivering Blackwood's message. "Congratulations on your marriage," they had said. "Hope you both live long enough to enjoy it." The threat lingered in the air long after hoofbeats faded. Zeke and Magnolia stood on the porch until silence reclaimed the night. Then she led him inside and set her satchel on the kitchen table with the weight of a coffin. "You need to see what I took." Her fingers worked the leather clasps with practiced precision. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay documents that could topple an empire: land deeds, forged contracts, bank transfers, letters bearing official seals, the accumulated evidence of systematic fraud stretching across 3 territories. Zeke lifted the first deed, his hands careful with the fragile paper. His own ranch was listed among properties Blackwood claimed to have purchased legitimately. The signature was a forgery so skilled it had fooled territorial officials. "How many families?" Zeke asked. 47 that I documented. "Probably twice that many I never knew about." Magnolia spread additional papers across the table. "He's been stealing land for 8 years, using it as collateral to buy more, building a railroad empire on foundations of fraud." Zeke studied maps mocking Blackwood's acquisitions. A pattern emerged, like constellations in a night sky, every property connected to every other, forming an unbroken corridor from Louisiana to the Colorado gold fields. "The railroad companies don't know they're buying stolen land," Magnolia continued. "When they discover the truth, the legal battles will bankrupt everyone involved, except Blackwood. He'll have moved his money offshore by then. Why didn't you take this to the territorial governor? With what proof of my own legitimacy?" Magnolia's laugh held no humor. "A escaped slave accusing a respected businessman. They'd hang me for theft and give him a medal for recovering stolen property." The weight of what she had risked to gather this evidence settled between them. She had traded her freedom for the possibility of justice, knowing she might never live to see it served. "But now you're married to a property owner," Zeke said slowly, "a white man with legal standing. Now we both have something to lose." They worked through the night cataloging documents and cross-referencing dates. The scope of Blackwood's operation revealed itself in ledger entries and falsified surveys. He had corrupted judges, bribed territorial officials, and eliminated competitors through intimidation and economic warfare. Dawn found them bent over maps and legal papers, their partnership deepening with each shared discovery. Magnolia's knowledge of business law complemented Zeke's understanding of local politics. Together, they began to see not just the problem, but potential solutions. "Tom Brennan," Zeke said, tapping a marked property. "Blackwood's been after his water rights for 2 years. Sarah Martinez lost her homestead last month. Blackwood claimed her late husband never filed proper papers. The Kowalski brothers, the Henderson place, half the farms in the valley." They were building a list of allies, families who had been wronged and might be willing to fight back if given hope of victory. But approaching them meant revealing the document's existence. It meant trusting their lives to people they barely knew. "Once we start this, there's no stopping," Magnolia said. "Blackwood won't just steal our land. He'll destroy everyone who stands with us." Zeke looked at the evidence spread across his kitchen table. His ranch had never felt more precious than in this moment when he understood how easily it could be lost. But the alternative was surrendering to corruption that would consume everything decent in the territory. "Then we better make sure we win." Over the following days, they began careful recruitment. Tom Brennan listened to their proposal with the intensity of a man who had waited years for hope. Sarah Martinez wept when she saw the forged documents that had cost her farm. Kowalski brothers studied the evidence with grim satisfaction, finally understanding how their father had lost land he had worked for 30 years. But gathering allies meant increased visibility. More people knew about the documents, more opportunities for betrayal or accident. Blackwood's surveillance intensified. His men appeared at the edges of their property daily, no longer hiding their presence. The town of Coyote Creek began choosing sides openly. Merchants who depended on Blackwood's business grew colder toward the McGraw and their supporters. Others, those who had suffered under his expansion, offered quiet assistance. Mrs. Henderson started leaving coded messages in Magnolia's grocery orders, information about which officials might be trustworthy, warnings about strangers asking questions. The elderly shopkeeper had lost her first husband to Blackwood's intimidation tactics 20 years earlier. That man's been poisoning this territory since before you were born. She told Magnolia while measuring flour. About time someone had the spine to stand up to him, but the pressure was taking its toll. Magnolia startled at sudden sounds. Zeke found himself checking locks. That had never been necessary before. They worked in shifts, one always watching while the other slept. Their marriage of convenience was becoming something deeper under the weight of shared danger. When Magnolia's hands shook from exhaustion and stress, Zeke would guide her to rest without speaking. When he stared too long at the horizon, watching for threats, she would draw his attention back to immediate tasks that needed doing. Trust was growing into something neither had expected. The careful distance they had maintained as practical strangers was dissolving into genuine partnership. They moved around each other in the small house with increasing comfort, anticipating needs and sharing burdens without discussion. One evening, as they worked by lamplight organizing testimonies from wronged families, Magnolia looked up to find Zeke watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "What, you're not what I expected when I made that proposal." "What did you expect?" Zeke was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "Someone grateful enough to stay out of my way. Someone who would keep house and not ask questions." Disappointed, humbled, he returned to his papers, but his admission hung in the air between them. "You could have run a dozen times by now, taken those documents and disappeared, started over somewhere safer." Magnolia set down her pen. The truth was more complicated than gratitude or strategy. Somewhere in the long nights of shared work and quiet meals, this place had become home. This man had become more than a convenient protector. "Running's easy," she said finally. "Staying to fight is harder." Outside, wind carried the scent of approaching rain. Storm clouds were building over the mountains, dark with the promise of violence. In the morning they would take their evidence to Justice Hale and ask him to help them present it to territorial authorities. Everything they had built together hung on that decision: their marriage, their land, their lives, the future of everyone who had chosen to trust them. Magnolia reached across the table and covered Zeke's hand with hers. His fingers were rough from ranch work, steady from years of facing difficulties alone. Now they faced the greatest difficulty together. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said. "Whatever happens," he agreed. Thunder rolled across the prairie closer. Now, the storm was coming whether they were ready for it or not. Blackwood arrived at midday with the certainty of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. His black carriage rolled through Coyote Creek's main street, followed by 4 mounted men whose hands never strayed far from their weapons. The entire town seemed to hold its breath as the procession stopped in front of the McGraw ranch. Cornelius Blackwood stepped down from his carriage with theatrical precision. His tailored suit and polished boots mocked him as a man who had never worked soil with his own hands, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had destroyed better people than himself without losing sleep. "Zeke McGraw," he called toward the house. "Time we had ourselves a conversation." Z and Magnolia emerged from the barn where they had been watching his approach. They walked side by side across the yard, neither hurrying nor hesitating. Blackwood's gaze fixed on Magnolia with recognition that sent ice through her veins. "Well, well, Magnolia Carter, though I suppose it's McGraw now." His voice carried the smooth poison of a snake oil salesman. Amazing how far a person can travel when they're motivated. "Mr. Blackwood." Magnolia kept her voice level despite the fear crawling up her spine. "I see you've expanded your operations since I left Louisiana. Business is good, very good." Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes, though I seem to have misplaced some important paperwork around the time of your departure. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The question hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Zeke moved slightly closer to Magnolia, a subtle shift that Blackwood noted with amusement. "I'm a simple rancher," Zeke said. "Don't know much about paperwork beyond cattle tallies and feed bills. Of course not." Blackwood adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate slowness. "But your wife here, she's quite accomplished with numbers. Kept my books for 3 years, very thorough, very observant." The admission confirmed what they all knew, but hadn't spoken aloud. Blackwood was here for the documents. Everything else was theater. "I've got a proposition for you both," Blackwood continued. "Fair and generous considering the circumstances. You pack up and leave the territory today. I'll even throw in enough money to get you started somewhere far away, California, maybe Oregon Territory, and if we refuse," Zeke asked, Blackwood's smile widened, "then tomorrow morning Sheriff Rawlings arrest your wife for murder. Seems there's new evidence about that unfortunate incident at the plantation. A witness who saw her kill Overseer Morrison in cold blood before setting fire to my property." Magnolia's hands clenched into fists. Morrison had died accidentally, falling from his horse while chasing her through the swamp, but she had no way to prove it, and Blackwood had unlimited resources to manufacture witnesses. "Murder's a hanging offense," Blackwood added conversationally, "especially when it involves a person of her particular background killing a white man. Territorial judges don't look kindly on that sort of thing." The threat settled over them like dust from a collapsed building. Death was no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate promise. Blackwood had played his strongest card, and they all knew it. "How long do we have to decide?" Zeke asked. "Sunrise, my generosity expires with the dawn." Blackwood returned to his carriage without looking back. His men followed in formation, a show of force designed to reinforce the ultimatum. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had changed everything. Zeke and Magnolia stood in their yard, watching the dust settle from departing wheels. The silence between them was heavier than words could have been. They were facing the end of everything they had built together. "He's not bluffing about the murder charge," Magnolia said finally. "I know they'll hang me whether the documents surface or not. He can't risk leaving me alive." Zeke turned to face her fully. In the harsh afternoon light, she looked fragile despite her strength. The thought of losing her hit him with unexpected force. "Then we run tonight, take the documents, and find someone in Denver who will listen and leave everyone here to face his retaliation. Tom Brennan, Sarah Martinez, all the families who trusted us." Magnolia shook her head. "He'll destroy them to make sure no one else gets ideas about standing up to him." They walked back toward the house in silence, both understanding the impossible choice they faced. Run and save themselves while abandoning their allies. Stay and fight with almost certain death as the price of failure. Inside, Magnolia sat at the kitchen table where they had spent so many nights planning their resistance. The documents remained hidden in the root cellar, but their presence seemed to fill the room with accusatory weight. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, "about why I really agreed to marry you." Zeke poured coffee from the pot that stayed warm on the stove. His movements were careful and deliberate, giving her time to find words for whatever confession was coming. I was already planning to come here to your ranch specifically." Magnolia stared at her hands folded on the table. "Your property sits at the center of everything Blackwood wants. I thought if I could convince you to fight, we might have a chance to stop him." The admission hung between them. Zeke set down his coffee cup and considered this revelation that their meeting hadn't been the accident he had assumed. "So you used me, at first." Magnolia looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "But that changed. Somewhere between the wedding and now, it became real. What we have, what we are to each other." Zeke studied her face, searching for deception and finding only vulnerability. The truth was more complex than simple manipulation. She had come to him with purpose, but purpose had evolved into something deeper. "When did it change for you?" he asked. "The night you brought me coffee while I worked on the books. You didn't say anything. Just set it down and went back to mending harnesses like we were already married. Really married." Zeke remembered that night, how natural it had felt to care for her comfort, how right it had seemed to share the quiet companionship of people who had chosen each other. "For me, it was when you held the fence post steady," he said. "You saw what needed doing and did it without being asked, like you belonged here." The confession broke something open between them. The careful distance they had maintained as partners in necessity dissolved into something more honest and more dangerous. "I love you," Magnolia said simply. "I didn't plan it, didn't want it, but it happened anyway." "I love you too." The words came easily now that truth was flowing between them, "which is why we have to find another way." They sat across from each other at the table where they had planned rebellion and discovered partnership. Outside, the sun was setting toward mountains that no longer seemed like distant refuge. Time was running out with the daylight. There might be a way, Magnolia said slowly, "but it means risking everything on one desperate gamble. Tell me." As she outlined her plan, Zeke felt his heart race with equal measures of hope and terror. It was audacious beyond reason. It would require perfect timing and enormous luck. It would pit them against forces far greater than themselves. But it might work, and if it worked, they could save not just themselves, but everyone Blackwood had wronged. "Are you willing?" Magnolia asked when she finished explaining. Zeke looked at his wife across the table. This woman who had stumbled into his life as a desperate stranger and become the center of his world. This fighter who had risked everything for justice and somehow found love in the process. Together, he said, together, she agreed. Outside night was falling over the prairie. Tomorrow would bring either freedom or death, but tonight they had each other and a plan born of desperation and love. The storm was coming, and they would meet it standing side by side. Dawn brought Sheriff Rawlings and 2 deputies to the McGraw ranch. They rode with the grim efficiency of men performing an unpleasant duty. Zeke and Magnolia waited on their porch, hands intertwined, watching death approach in the form of legal authority. "Magnolia McGraw," Rawlings called from his saddle, "you're under arrest for the murder of William Morrison." "She's not going anywhere," Zeke said. Rawlings dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his weapon. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Zeke. Step aside." Before the confrontation could escalate, another rider approached from the direction of town. Justice of the Peace Tobias Hale urged his horse forward with unusual urgency, his normally pale face flushed with excitement. "Sheriff Rawlings," Hale called. "Hold there a moment." Rawlings turned with visible irritation. "This is official business, Tobias. Murder charges don't wait for paperwork." Hale dismounted and approached with the careful steps of a man carrying explosive news. He pulled documents from his saddle bags with hands that shook slightly from nerves rather than age. "I've been corresponding with the territorial governor's office about certain irregularities in local land transactions," Hale announced. "Received an interesting reply yesterday evening." He unfolded official papers bearing territorial seals. The morning wind tried to snatch them from his grasp, but he held firm. It seems there's been a federal investigation into railroad land acquisitions. Specifically, properties purchased by Cornelius Blackwood over the past 8 years. Rawlings stiffened. His deputies exchanged glances that suggested this news was as unexpected to them as to everyone else. "What kind of investigation?" Magnolia asked. "The kind that involves federal marshals and charges of interstate fraud," Hale replied. "The territorial governor has issued warrants for Blackwood's arrest along with orders to secure any evidence related to his business practices." The sheriff's face went through several complicated expressions. His loyalty to Blackwood was battling with his instinct for self-preservation. Federal charges meant federal oversight. Local corruption became much more dangerous when Washington started paying attention. "That doesn't change the murder warrant," Rawlings said finally. "Actually, it does." Hale produced another document. "This is a statement from William Morrison." The impossible words hit the morning air with the force of lightning. Magnolia felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Morrison's dead," she whispered. "Morrison's very much alive," Hale corrected. "Recovering from a broken leg and various injuries sustained when he fell from his horse during what he describes as an unauthorized pursuit of escaped plantation workers. He's been in a Denver hospital for the past 6 months. The fabricated murder charge crumbled like sand. Blackwood's strongest weapon revealed itself as an elaborate bluff designed to force their compliance through terror." Rawlings holstered his weapon with visible reluctance. "How do we know this Morrison fellow is telling the truth because he's been cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for immunity?" Hale explained, providing details about Blackwood's operations that matched certain documents recently brought to my attention. Zeke and Magnolia exchanged glances loaded with understanding. Their desperate gamble was working. The evidence they had risked everything to preserve was finding its way to people with the power to act on it. "I've also been reviewing the legal status of certain marriages performed in my jurisdiction." Hale continued, "The union between Ezekiel and Magnolia McGraw was properly filed with territorial authorities. Any attempt to dissolve it through local pressure would constitute interference with federal witnesses. The protection was more comprehensive than they had dared hope. Their marriage was legally unassailable. The murder charges were false. Federal law enforcement was taking interest in their evidence, but victory came with new dangers. Blackwood would know by now that his bluff had failed. A cornered man with his resources and desperation would become infinitely more dangerous. "Where is Blackwood now?" Zeke asked. "Gone," Rawlings admitted. "Left town before dawn with his men. Headed west toward the mountain passes, running or regrouping." The sheriff's expression suggested he knew which option was more likely. A man like Blackwood doesn't surrender easy. "He's got too much to lose." Hale folded his documents with satisfaction. "Federal marshals will arrive within the week. Until then, I suggest everyone remain vigilant." After the lawmen departed, Zeke and Magnolia stood alone in their yard. The crisis that had threatened to destroy them had transformed into something manageable. Not victory yet, but the possibility of victory. "Morrison's alive," Magnolia said, still struggling to process the revelation. "You never killed anyone. I never killed anyone." She repeated the words with wonder. "All this time I thought I had blood on my hands." Zeke pulled her close, feeling the tension drain from her body. The guilt she had carried for months was lifting with the morning mist, but questions remained about how their evidence had reached federal authorities. "Hale's been working with investigators for months," Magnolia realized. "That's why he was so nervous during our wedding. He knew about the federal case and Rawlings playing both sides, keeping Blackwood happy while protecting federal interests." She looked toward town, where dust still marked the sheriff's passage. "Smart man, corrupt enough to survive locally, careful enough to avoid federal charges. They walked back toward the house where their hidden documents waited in the root cellar. Evidence that had seemed like a death sentence now represented salvation for dozens of families. "What happens next?" Zeke asked. "We wait, give testimony when the marshals arrive, help other families recover their stolen land." Magnolia paused at the porch steps, build the life we started. The future stretched before them with possibilities they hadn't dared imagine days earlier. Their marriage of desperation had survived its first great test. Love had grown strong enough to face whatever challenges remained, but the mountains where Blackwood had fled still loomed on the western horizon. Dark clouds gathered above the peaks, promising storms that would test the prairie's ability to endure. "He's not finished with us," Magnolia said quietly. "No, but neither are we finished with him." They entered their house hand in hand. The kitchen, where they had planned rebellion, now felt like the command center of a war they might actually win. Documents that had nearly cost their lives would become weapons in the cause of justice. Outside, wind stirred the grass and rattled the barn door. Weather was changing. The long drought that had gripped the territory showed signs of breaking. Rain would come eventually, washing the dust from struggling crops and filling streams that had run dry. Zeke began preparing breakfast while Magnolia sorted through correspondence that had accumulated during their crisis. Normal domestic routines felt precious after days of facing death. Letter from Tom Brennan. She announced he wants to organize the families who lost land, present a unified case to the federal investigators. Sarah Martinez ready to testify. She kept copies of all the fraudulent papers they used to steal her farm. The network of allies they had built was holding strong. Fear was transforming into hope as word spread that justice might finally be possible. But as Magnolia read through messages of support and offers of cooperation, she found herself watching the western mountains where Blackwood had disappeared. Men like him didn't surrender their empires without final, desperate acts of vengeance. The storm was still coming. They had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. The town meeting hall filled beyond capacity on the day federal marshals arrived in Coyote Creek. Families who had lost land to Blackwood schemes crowded onto benches and lined the walls. Their faces carried the weathered hope of people who had waited years for justice. Marshal James Whitmore stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding without theatrics. Behind him, two deputies arranged documents on a table that groaned under the weight of evidence. Magnolia and Zeke sat in the front row, their hands intertwined. "We're here to investigate allegations of systematic land fraud," Whitmore announced. "Every family affected will have the opportunity to present their case." Tom Brennan rose first, his testimony laying groundwork for the pattern of corruption. Sarah Martinez followed, her voice steady as she described forged papers and stolen inheritance. The Kowalski brothers spoke of their father's lifetime of work erased by fraudulent surveys. When Magnolia's turn came, she approached the front of the room with documents that had nearly cost her life. The crowd fell silent as she began recounting Blackwood's operations from the inside. Her knowledge of his business practices provided the framework that connected individual crimes into a comprehensive conspiracy. "These ledgers detail 8 years of systematic fraud," she explained, opening books that recorded the theft of entire communities, property stolen through forged deeds, corrupt officials, and intimidation of legitimate owners. Marshal Whitmore examined the evidence with professional thoroughness. Each document was catalogued, cross-referenced, verified against territorial records. The scope of Blackwood's empire became clear as the investigation proceeded. "Where is Cornelius Blackwood now?" Whitmore asked. "Fled west 3 days ago. Sheriff Rawlings admitted from the back of the room. Haven't seen hide nor hair of him since. His associates gone with him, left town like the devil was chasing them." But even as testimony continued, Magnolia felt unease growing in her chest. Blackwood's disappearance seemed too convenient, too complete. Men who built empires didn't abandon them without final acts of vengeance. The feeling proved prophetic when a rider burst through the meeting hall doors. Young Billy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's grandson, stumbled forward with urgent news. "Fire," he gasped. "The Martinez place is burning." Someone torched the barn and house. The crowd erupted in angry murmurs. Sarah Martinez pushed through the crowd toward the door, but Marshal Whitmore raised his hand for order. "Nobody leaves alone," he commanded. "We go together armed, and we stay alert." The procession that rode toward the Martinez homestead moved with grim determination. Smoke rose from the horizon, black against the afternoon sky. By the time they arrived, nothing remained but smoldering ruins and the acrid smell of destroyed dreams. "This is Blackwood's doing," Tom Brennan said, surveying the devastation. "Proof?" Marshal Whitmore asked. "Who else?" Sarah Martinez stood among the ashes of her rebuilt life, her face carved from stone. "He's making an example, showing what happens to people who testify against him." The marshal examined the scene with professional attention. Burn patterns suggested accelerant. The destruction was too complete, too systematic to be accidental. This was intimidation refined to an art form. "He's still here," Magnolia realized, somewhere close, watching. The thought sent ice through everyone present. Blackwood hadn't fled in defeat. He had retreated to prepare a campaign of terror designed to silence witnesses and destroy evidence. "We postcards," Whitmore decided. "Nobody stays alone until this is finished." That evening the McGraw Ranch became an unofficial fortress. Tom Brennan and his sons took positions around the property perimeter. The Kowalski brothers established watch posts near the barn and main house. Even Mrs. Henderson arrived with her late husband's rifle and a determination that belied her advanced years. "This is our fight now," she told Magnolia while checking her ammunition. "That man's been terrorizing this community for too long." Inside the house, Magnolia and Zeke worked by lamplight, organizing testimonies and evidence for the federal case. The documents that had started their journey together would soon bring justice for dozens of families. "What happens after?" Zeke asked during a quiet moment. "After Blackwood's arrested, after everything, when the trials are over, and the land is returned, what happens to us?" Magnolia looked up from the papers spread across their kitchen table. The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Their marriage had been born of desperation, forged in crisis, tested by mortal danger. What would it become in peacetime? "We build something real," she said. "Something that belongs to us instead of something we're fighting to keep. The school you talked about, schools, plural, for every child in the territory, regardless of color or circumstance." Her voice carried dreams that had grown beyond personal survival. "We use Blackwood's stolen wealth to create something good." Zeke nodded, understanding the vision she was painting. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation, about turning instruments of oppression into tools of liberation. A shout from outside interrupted their planning. Tom Brennan's voice carried urgent warning across the yard. Riders coming, armed men from the west. Zeke blew out the lamp and moved to the window. In the moonlight he could see mounted figures approaching along the ridge. Too many to count, moving with military precision. Blackwood. Magnolia asked, or federal reinforcements, but Zeke's tone suggested he didn't believe the optimistic interpretation. The riders descended toward the ranch with deliberate slowness. No hurry marked their approach. They moved with the confidence of men who believed victory was inevitable. Marshal Whitmore emerged from the barn where he had been interviewing witnesses. His presence seemed to give pause to the approaching riders. Federal authority carried weight even in lawless territories. "That's far enough," Whitmore called into the darkness. A familiar voice answered from shadows. Cornelius Blackwood rode forward on a white horse that gleamed like bone in the moonlight. His expensive suit was dusty from travel, but his bearing remained imperious. "Marshal Whitmore," Blackwood said with mock courtesy. "Pleasure to make your acquaintance. Cornelius Blackwood. Your Under arrest for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Am I? Blackwood's laugh carried no humor. Based on what evidence? Documents stolen by a fugitive, testimony from disgruntled former employees. Based on federal warrants issued by territorial authority that I helped establish. Judges I helped elect, officials whose campaigns I funded. Blackwood spurred his horse closer. You're a long way from Washington, Marshal. Out here, different rules apply. The standoff crystallized into its essential elements: federal law against local corruption, evidence against intimidation. Justice against power. The outcome would determine not just individual fates, but the future of an entire territory. Last chance, Whitmore said. Surrender peacefully or face the consequences. Blackwood's response came in the form of action rather than words. His men spread out to surround the ranch buildings. The siege that followed would test everything Zeke and Magnolia had built together. But as dawn broke over the prairie, it revealed not defeat, but triumph. Territorial militia surrounded Blackwood's men. Federal marshals arrested the corrupt officials who had enabled his crimes. Empire built on fraud and violence crumbled in the morning light. Months later, Zeke and Magnolia stood in the same schoolyard where their love had first bloomed under pressure. But now children's laughter filled the air instead of threats. The building that housed Magnolia's school had been constructed with funds recovered from Blackwood's accounts. Mrs. McGraw, a small voice called, "Will you read us another story?" Magnolia smiled at the mixed group of children who gathered around her. Their faces represented every background, every heritage that called the territory home. The future they were building would be inclusive in ways the past had never allowed. What story would you like to hear? The one about the lady who saved everyone. Zeke watched from the doorway as his wife settled among the children. Their marriage had begun with desperate words on a threshold. It had grown into something that transformed not just their lives, but their entire community. The school bell rang across the prairie, calling children to lessons and adults to hope. The sound carried on wind that no longer whispered of drought and desperation, but of rain and renewal. The story that had started with a plea for help had become a testament to the power of love and justice combined, and that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.